Good morning in Washington. Good afternoon in Europe. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful discussion for you this morning to talk about the NATO summit in Vilnius and what comes next. And we have an all-star cast of panelists from Odessa, which Moscow has been bombing mercilessly for the last 3 days as it tries to kill the grain deal. We have Alexei Honcharенko, member of the Parliament of Ukraine. In Washington, we have Ambassador Doug Lute, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, also General Lute, former current board director of the Atlantic Council, and also a former deputy national security advisor. We have Tom Malinowski as well, John S. McCain Senior Fellow at the McCain Institute, former Democratic congressman, former senior Democratic administration official on foreign policy. And from Warsaw, we have Katarina Pisarska, the founder and chair of the Warsaw Security Forum. I will ask our wonderful panelists some questions, and then we will take audience questions, which you can put in. There's something in your system which you'd be able to add questions. So we'll start with General Lute. As a former ambassador to NATO and deputy NSC advisor, you're uniquely qualified to comment on the summit. Many observers consider the summit historic and credit the administration for the admission of Finland, the resolution of the problem to the entry of Sweden, and serious steps taken towards boosting deployments on NATO's eastern flank. At the same time, the critical issue of NATO-Ukraine led to major tensions in the run-up to the summit, during the summit, and the eventual NATO position in Vilnius has proved controversial. How do you evaluate the summit, and especially the Ukraine question?
Well, John, thanks to you and the Council for hosting this morning, Eastern Time. You know, a week before Vilnius, I listed 4 issues that were going to be challenges for the summit. These were who's going to be the next Secretary General? What about Sweden? What are we going to say about new defense planning and the resources required to fuel that defense planning? And then fourth, the topic of this morning's conversation, what do we say about Ukraine? And you know, for every NATO summit, going back now next year, 75 years, every NATO summit is expected to have one deliverable, one strategic outcome, and that's cohesion, solidarity. And the vehicle to cohesion is compromise. So across these 4 issues, NATO was seeking compromise at Vilnius. And if we could just quickly tick through those, I think they were successful. So the bottom line on the Vilnius summit is that NATO came out together, came out unified, but with some compromise solutions. So Jens Stoltenberg was extended for a year as the NATO Secretary General, so that was a compromise. Sweden was at least advanced in its path towards membership, with President Erdogan of Turkey relenting on his blockage of Sweden's membership. To 2% of GDP committed to defense in terms of resourcing those defense plans. And on Ukraine, which I think will be the rest of this hour, we'll talk about the compromise solution that saw Ukraine at least perhaps moving a step closer to membership, but leaving many dissatisfied with the extent of that progress towards membership. But the bottom line, I think, John, is even with the topic, the most contentious topic, Ukraine, NATO came out of the Vilnius summit unified, solidified, and cohesive, and that is no better pictured than the sort of family photo at the end of the summit, when all 31 allies with the Secretary General are posed for one photo. And in my mind, this is always a very stark contrast, imagining Putin's counterpart photo, right, where perhaps he's there with Lukashenko, or one or two Central Asian leaders and so forth. So there's a real sharp contrast between the unity of NATO and anyone which opposes NATO.
Thank you. Okay. Mr. Goncharенko, you're a RADA member and very active in the debate on aid to Ukraine and, of course, the NATO-Ukraine relationship. The summit did upgrade the NATO-Ukraine Commission to a council. It dropped the requirement for a membership action plan for Ukraine's membership. But senior Ukrainian officials and many other Ukrainians consider this extremely modest progress. President Zelensky expresses this satisfaction in a blunt tweet that annoyed the White House. How do you evaluate the summit's treatment of Ukraine? And what is the view in Ukraine of the summit and the U.S. role in the outcome?
Yeah, hello, Ambassador. Thank you very much to you and to Atlantic Council for organizing of such event and for constant support of our country for all these years. And was very important summit. I had an honor to be there personally and saw everything by my own eyes, as well as I was in Madrid a year ago. And I can tell you that first, so your question is, and given my estimation, it's not a victory, it's not a catastrophe. But what is the real problem? Real problem is that we have one witness of this, one viewer of this, who was probably the most important. His name is Vladimir Putin. And for him, the language which was used in the final communique of the summit was the language of hesitation. And the only language he understands is the language of force. So if it would be said that Ukraine is invited to NATO, again, invitation does not equal membership. Oh, it will be said more clearly how and when Ukraine will be invited to become a member of NATO. That would be much, much better. Unfortunately, that's a good thing we have the word invitation, but it is not so clear. And it's clear that there are hesitations in NATO. That's the big problem. And I think what we have now with these attacks on Odessa and attack on grain deal, it's because Putin felt himself emboldened after the summit because he felt that he can still achieve his goals. And the question is why? And definitely that most of this decision, that more modest language about Ukraine, that was the first of all decision of the United States of America. We know this, we know how it was happening. We know there was a lot of pressure from the Eastern European countries in support of Ukraine. And we know that the United Kingdom, France, Italy were supportive. And we know that Germany and the United States were against more courageous steps. From one point of view, I understand, because it's United States who carries this burden of the security, because in reality, it's the United States which is providing security to European countries and not vice versa. But I think this modest language is the result of two problems. One of which is that some people in Washington still, they want Ukraine to win, but at the same time, they are afraid of Russia to lose because of all chaos which can happen there, because of mass destruction weaponry, who will control it. We saw all Wagner mutiny and Prigozhin's mutiny, and that shows to them, and they think that they are right about this, that something horrible can happen there, and they try to avoid it with all these red lines, with weaponry supply and all of this. I believe this is a mistake. And the second question, which is still open for many people, I think, in the Washington, is, yeah, it's clear why Ukraine needs NATO. But the question is why NATO needs Ukraine. And here, I think there is a very strong answer. Ukraine can be the strongest ally of the United States because we are a very militarized country now and for decades ahead. We're a very traumatized country now and for decades ahead. And just, maybe I will put it a little bit too frank and straightforward, but tell me, just honestly, real talk, who will be in trenches near Beijing or Tehran with US Army? I'm not so sure that French army will be there or Hungarian army will be there, with all respect to these countries. But I'm sure that Ukrainian army is ready to be there. We don't have any other choice after what we are coming through. So that is very important, I think, moment, which we should explain that Ukraine is also the very valuable addition to NATO and a very valuable ally of the United States of America. And after answering these two questions, I hope that next year in Washington, because our topic is what's next. Next is Washington. So let us watch at Vilnius summit as the first step. The first step is made. There is some word invitation. There is no more membership action plan. So now let us work together, and in Washington, we should receive official invitation for Ukraine to join NATO. I believe this is mutually beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski, you have great experience at senior levels of U.S. policy, both in the U.S. administration and Congress. The White House has insisted that Ukraine making democratic reforms a condition for NATO membership, but has not articulated precisely what is required. This has prompted some critics to claim that this is merely an aim to slow down movement towards closer Ukraine-NATO relationship and eventual NATO membership for Ukraine. What is driving a White House policy on NATO-Ukraine?
Thank you, John. I would say everybody is doing their job in this complicated dance that we've seen in Vilnius and beyond. Ukrainians are waking up every single morning struggling for survival, and they're doing their job, which is to ask the United States and the West for everything as quickly as possible to ensure their victory and their survival. The United States, the White House, sees its job as helping Ukraine survive and win, while at the same time keeping Americans out of the war for a whole host of reasons, including domestic political reasons, which are perfectly sound, and also is maintaining the responsibility that other smaller European countries don't have of avoiding some other kind of catastrophe that would go well beyond Ukraine. Whether that's right or wrong, that's how the White House, how the president feels about their side of this responsibility. And so what we got was kind of a compromise, a clear statement, including from the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, after the summit, which I think he believes sincerely that Ukraine's future is in NATO, but at the same time, a policy that basically says it'll happen when Ukraine meets certain conditions and when the war is over. Now, that policy statement gives rise to two obvious questions that we now need to help them and encourage them to answer. The first is, okay, there are conditions, as you suggested. What are the conditions? It's okay to have conditions. There always have been when NATO has expanded. In fact, one of the purposes of NATO expansion historically has been to incentivize candidate countries to adopt reforms, to make changes, to become better and stronger potential allies. That's fine. But the president owes the Ukrainian government a clear list, a clear checklist as quickly as possible. Otherwise, this will be seen as a punt rather than a policy. The second question, and this is, I think, even more important and more complicated, is, well, what is meant by the war has to be over? How do you define the end of the war from the standpoint of NATO membership for Ukraine? Well, what are the possibilities? One possibility would be a spectacular military victory for Ukraine leading to a peace treaty with Russia. We all know that's very unlikely, particularly the peace treaty with Russia part. Russia never ends its wars by acknowledging it has won or lost or agreeing to any kind of settlement. Even a ceasefire along some agreed line of division seems to be somewhat unlikely if it requires Russia to agree, especially if Russia knows that the moment it signs on the dotted line of that ceasefire, Ukraine is in NATO. So the question I have for the White House is whether there is a different scenario possible, a scenario in which Ukraine, in effect, defines what the end of the war is from the standpoint of opening the door to NATO membership. So imagine we have a situation a year from now, around the time of the Washington NATO summit, in which Ukraine has made significant progress on the battlefield, but perhaps it hasn't yet retaken all of its territory, including Crimea. Is there a scenario in which Ukraine is given a choice at that point, in effect, to start focusing westward rather than fighting eastward? In other words, where the United States would say to Ukraine, if you keep fighting, if you keep trying to take Crimea by military means, we will support you in all the ways that we have thus far. That is your choice. But if at that point you, in effect, declare that this stage of the war is over, you get NATO membership with full Article 5 defense guarantees for the significant share of Ukraine that you have already liberated. Personally, I think that's an option Ukraine should have. in a way that maintains Ukrainian agency over the definition of victory, over the definition of how the war ends. Personally, I think NATO membership would be a form of victory, and I would like to see Ukraine get that option sooner rather than later. This would also be consistent with the policy that the White House laid out, and I do think, whether we agree with it or not, the only way Ukraine gets into NATO is in a way that's consistent with the principles that the president and his team have put out there, and that would be one of them.
I'm going to go a little bit beyond moderator here, Tom, to say that you just laid out a very interesting idea. I can tell you this, that I've had complaints from senior Ukrainians that if in fact what was possible, if you would describe were possible, it would be useful for senior American officials to convey that to them. Just putting that out there.
Yeah, well, I don't think they figured this out.
Okay.
I don't think that there's not like a secret plan at the White House that they haven't told us about.
Right.
They're improvising as they go along, but at the same time, when the president and the national security advisor state a policy, when they say things like the war has to be over, that then becomes real. And the only question, and the interesting one, is, well, what do those words actually mean? That's where there's flexibility. That's where we can help them figure this out.
That was the most interesting part of your statement, parsing that. Okay, Dr. Pizarska, while the media focused on the public tension between the United States and Ukraine, equally interesting, or maybe even more interesting, was, as already described, the strong push by East European members of NATO to have a more ambitious outcome for the Ukraine-NATO relationship. Some observers say, and actually this is implicit in what Ambassador Lutz said, that the communique language would have been weaker were it not for the united efforts of the East European countries. What can you tell us about this? And is this a sign of a new grouping within NATO that will, in the run-up to next year's Washington summit, NATO summit, have an impact? Please.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for the invitation, and greetings from Warsaw. I was, in fact, in Vilnius during the public part, the public forum of the summit, alongside with Alex. So we really felt these tensions and emotions run extremely high last week. And to tell you the truth, I am coming back from Vilnius absolutely convinced that the outcome could have been different. There was a lot of things on the table. Things were decided at the very last moment. Things were scrapped out and then put back together into the communique. So I think this was a truly live summit, a summit at times of war. And of course, the Central Europeans, but not only, actually to our surprise also in the last few weeks, also France, have pushed very strongly for a swift enlargement of NATO, of including Ukraine into the transatlantic alliance. And there's two reasons for this. First of all, we have a living memory of being ourselves candidate states, candidate countries. And I can assure you that when we were trying to get an invitation to NATO in the 1990s, most of Washington was at the beginning opposed. I remember President Clinton being opposed. I remember Secretary Albright being opposed. I remember us Poles organizing a huge advocacy campaign, lobbying campaign within the Congress, trying to convince the Senate to support the enlargement of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic at that time. So we do understand that positions change; they require time, but also the last decades of our membership in NATO have proven that this is the best deterrence against a revisionist Russia, and that NATO membership is the ultimate security guarantee for Ukraine. So there is no doubt about this in this part of Europe. Second, and I think this has to be brought to the discussion, days before the summit, I was for a week in Kiev speaking with state officials, but also civil society about their expectations on NATO guarantees. And of course, it will be no surprise that that they expected a clear commitment to a path forward, a clear path forward to NATO membership. But that's not what I found the most interesting, because this was obvious. The most interesting, I thought, is that there is a change of mood on the Ukrainian streets. And I think we completely underestimate what is happening currently in Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine a few times during the war already, so I can feel these changes happening. And now, for the first time, we see people becoming more and more angry, more and more frustrated. They are definitely still extremely determined to win the war, to fight the Russians. But we were, as an international delegation, approached many times by people on the streets asking, "But what are you doing more to help us? Why aren't you here more?" And this, of course, comes from the simple reason that people are losing their relatives, they're losing their friends on a daily basis. This is a level of grief that is just mounting. So this is why President Zelensky, coming to the Vilnius summit, was expecting the maximum, because he feels this frustration, and this frustration was also felt in his statement at the beginning. Ukraine simply has no time. This is not the 1990s where we could do an advocacy campaign and wait for a few years and convince everyone. We are at a state of war. NATO is de facto in times where war is on its borders. So the question is, of course, cohesion is key. Of course, cooperation, is also extremely important with Ukraine. But we all felt, at least at the summit, that much more could have been done in order to deter Russia, and especially in the area of security guarantees, future security guarantees for Ukraine. I think, there was a lot of disappointment coming up from Vilnius at the end of the day.
Thank you. General Lute, what do you expect to see in terms of the Ukraine-NATO relationship at the Washington summit, and what would you like to see?
Well, the first thing I'd like to see, John, is that we give Ukraine the military assistance, the economic assistance, the political support it needs to actually win this fight. I mean, so far, across all the participants in this conference, there's one key condition, and that is the Ukraine's got to win the war. So first things first, we should stop this incremental bureaucratic approach to military assistance, which sees us giving small, discrete increments, roughly on a every other week basis, to just keep Ukraine in the fight. And we should stop that, and we should begin a program of giving wholehearted support to Ukraine so they can actually win. And then we can begin to meet the conditions that Tom Malinowski laid out. But none of this makes any sense if Ukraine doesn't win the fight. So we should be all in. And I would argue that the often repeated phrase of "we're with Ukraine as long as it takes" is insufficient. It should be as long as it takes with as much as it takes. And we've come up short on that second provision. So we've seen, for example, most recently, the addition of DPICM, these cluster munitions. Okay, great. But these, millions of those rounds are available a year ago. F-16s are available now. Training is only going to begin in several months. And so this bureaucratic, incremental, just enough to keep Ukraine in the fight approach is, I think, especially damaging. So before we get to membership, which should be our goal, right? Before we get to that, Ukraine's got to win the fight. So what I would hope is that more and more attention is paid to the G7 agreements, to up the ante in terms of bilateral support to Ukraine. And I'm going to watch very carefully in the coming weeks exactly where are these bilateral agreements of military assistance to Ukraine that was promised by the G7, and how substantive are they? So the first thing we need to do on the path to Washington is help Ukraine win.
I think most people, certainly everyone on this panel agrees with that. I just note that still Washington has not given permission for actual training on actual F-16s and is still refusing on ATACMS, but okay. Next, Mr. Goncharenko, we've already mentioned you're under siege, you're under bombardment in Odessa as Moscow says no to prolonging the grain deal. What, in your judgment, is going to happen next? Russia is trying to make sure your grain loading facilities in Odessa will not work. But if in fact a ship shows up there to take Ukrainian grain, Moscow is threatening to strike it. What do you think will happen? And more importantly, what should the West do in response to this?
Yeah, thank you very much. Great question. First of all, I want to thank Ambassador Lute for what he said. Exactly what's needed. Really, Ukraine needs to win. Answering your question, yes, 3 days in Odessa are very hard. That's the biggest missile and drone attacks from the start of invasion. And every day, every night it continues. It's really exhausting. And that's a big problem. But why Putin is doing it? Because Putin is so afraid that his bluff don't work. Because I believe that all Russia is saying that we will prevent ships from coming to Odessa, we will attack ships. It's bluffing. Because let us imagine, ships, the vessels under Turkish flag are coming to take Ukrainian grain to Odessa port. And do we really believe that Putin will attack a Turkish ship? It will mean the beginning of war against Turkey. All the ship under UK flag or under Chinese flag, I don't know. So it's impossible for Putin to attack it. He doesn't have this possibility. He is so exhausted in Ukraine, just with Ukraine. And how could he open new front lines? That's why it's bluffing. That's why by these attacks on Odessa, he tries to prevent ship owners, insurance companies to make this step and to send the vessels to Odessa. What should be made? I believe that the free world made a big mistake when at the beginning of this invasion, let Putin to close the Black Sea. This is a very dangerous precedent, not just because it's the Black Sea and from the times of ancient Greeks, it is the food basket of the world, and definitely millions of people will starve if the grain deal will not be restored, and there will be destabilization in many countries, new waves of refugees, chaos in the world. That's what Putin wants to do. But even if not to take just the Black Sea, if one tyrant can close the Black Sea, why he can't close Baltic Sea or Arctic waters? Or why Chairman Xi can't close the South Chinese Sea? That is very dangerous precedent. And I believe the only answer, as I already said, the only language Putin understands is the language of force. I want to remind you that in October last year, Russia already left the deal, saying after Ukrainian sea drone attacks on Sevastopol, they said, we're leaving the deal. Erdogan said, okay, we're continuing without you. And in 2 days, Russians came back. That's what I think should be done. The world should say there will be military convoys guarding the ships. Odessa should be provided with extra air defense to protect the ports because of its humanitarian meaning for the whole planet. And that's all. And all this Putin's bluff will go to nothing. That's the best option.
Okay, thank you. All right. Tom, what are U.S. interests in the NATO-Ukraine issue and also more broadly Moscow's war in Ukraine? And what do you would like to see happen at the Washington summit?
Sure. Well, I think our interests in Ukraine are very clear. It's making sure that the rules that have held the world together since World War II are preserved and maintained for another century. Our interests in Ukraine and NATO, I think, can be expressed in fairly cautious and conservative terms. In other words, this is not, Ukraine and NATO is not just a matter of protecting Ukraine from another invasion. It's not just a matter of rewarding Ukraine for the extraordinary sacrifice that Ukrainians have made to protect all of our freedom. It's also, for me, and I think for the United States, about ensuring that this country that is, as we've heard, highly militarized, aggrieved, is in the future tethered to the Western alliance and not a free agent. So this is the argument I would make to the more pragmatic, more conservative, more cautious folks in the Biden administration. That when this is over, it is we should want Ukraine to be embedded in all of the structures of NATO, where yes, we give Ukraine Article 5, but we also get Article 4, where Ukraine has to consult with NATO allies before it takes any military action in defense of its interests. The alternative that's been presented in Washington is the so-called Israel scenario, in which we continue to arm Ukraine to the teeth, but it's not embedded in any alliance structure. I actually don't think that's in the US national security interest. Israel is not in a NATO-type alliance because it wants to maintain complete freedom of action. That's not always good for the United States. I think in this scenario, ironically, we'll be much less likely to be dragged into some war that we don't want 10 or 20 years from now if NATO expands to include Ukraine. Ukraine is an ally, part of the command structure, with that obligation to cooperate and consult before doing anything that we might not see as in our interests.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Pisarska. Poland has taken a leadership role regarding the deliberations of NATO members on arms to Ukraine and, of course, on the NATO-Ukraine relationship. Do you think that the greater concern regarding Russian aggression expressed by Poland and other East European allies, and now Finland and Sweden, will move NATO policy, and how?
Before I answer that question, let me get back to what Tom was talking about, other
please.
potential scenarios for security guarantees for Ukraine. And I think, that there have been a few of them. Israeli is one. I would add to it that Israel has also nuclear warheads and weapons. And the question is, would we agree for Ukraine to develop its own in such a scenario? I think nobody would like to see that happening as well. There's, of course, also the South Korea scenario. That does require boots on the ground. Hundreds of thousands in the past, now thousands of American soldiers there. So I have to stress the same as Tom says, when we do the analysis, NATO enlargement seems to be the least costly, but also a security guarantee, that's on one side. But I would also like to recall the simple fact that we are bringing into NATO an extremely experienced in the battlefield member state, a country that we, at least here in Poland, are learning from at this stage in how to deal with modern warfare. That, of course, encompasses not only the battlefield, but the space of information and many things more. So I think, from our side, from our point of view, this is also an important addition to NATO. But we also understand that, as we say here, Caesar says. So the final decision will be made in Washington. Nobody has any doubts about that. It's not going to be the Germans. It's not even going to be the Turks. If there will be a decision in Washington, D.C. to include Ukraine, Ukraine will become a member state, even if it will take a bit more time for building that cohesion and convincing some of the less convinced member states. Is that possible? Is the tide turning? Of course, I think Ukraine has never been closer to NATO membership. I think that at the end of the day, we need to also be a bit positive. We, for the first time, really heard in Vilnius that everybody agrees now that NATO membership is the ultimate goal. But the devil is in the details. When, how, at what conditions? I think our Ukrainian friends and even us also were a bit, we felt a bit discomforted by the fact that the final communique was talking about, the question of reforms, of many other things that, of course, are very important. But I think it was the wrong timing to bring these things up. If there is, in fact, a number of conditions that need to be met, these have to be very clearly stated. And the final communique was extremely broad, and it could mean everything at the end for everyone. What should concern us is what was said, I think, by Alex already, is what does Putin make of it? What does Russia make of it? How has this been read in Russia? And I am afraid that, they did not conclude that NATO is as united as ever. They will see rather cracks, just like they used the Bucharest summit in 2008, where the membership action plan, was denied to Ukraine and Georgia. They took this as an opportunity to understand we will not defend Ukraine and Georgia over the long term. I fear, under my skin, that this might have been interpreted like this in Moscow, whether we like it or not at the end of the day. But again, I see the tide is turning. I think Finland, Sweden will be also very big proponents of further enlargements, especially to Ukraine. And, I think now we have a year, because we don't have more. Ukrainians know they don't have more. It's Washington or nothing, to actually make that case in Washington, and then in other capitals that might be less inclined to support a swift accession of Ukraine into NATO.
Thank you. Okay, before I turn to audience questions, I'm going to throw one curveball. Tom, you mentioned the Israeli option, and Katarina also spoke about that. The cynic in me says the following, and I'd appreciate your responses and also Doug's responses, because Doug spoke about the importance of a stronger American policy on sending weapons to Ukraine to win the war. Some of the same people who are dribbling out American weapons, not sending what's needed in a prompt way, are also advocates of the quote-unquote Israeli option. In other words, they're saying in terms of the Israeli option, we should arm Ukraine to the teeth, but they're not doing that right now when Ukraine really needs it. Any comments on that? And then Doug, you too.
Well, that's a question that answers itself. Look, a lot of the arguments are punts. A lot of the arguments are just filling space while we figure things out that we haven't yet figured out. And I think they're questions that the administration hasn't answered internally. And so these other things dribble out. Well, they need to continue their democratization, right? And I don't know if you noticed, but a Biden administration official was asked in an on-the-record briefing in Vilnius, well, okay, what does that mean? What are the reforms that Ukraine has to take? And her answer was, well, the Ukrainians will tell us themselves what reforms they need to make, which I was surprised Zelensky didn't immediately send an email to the White House saying, here are the 3 things. I do 10 things. We sing the national anthem and done, right? And then on Israel, it's the same thing. I think that's just sort of an argument to excuse not having yet made certain decisions. If you really, if you really think about that Israel option, I don't think that Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, and Tony Blinken want another Israel. As much as we support Israel in the United States, I don't think they want Ukraine to be like Israel. So that's not real. One cautionary note that I have to throw in as a former member of Congress, I agree with General Lute and with everybody here, we should be giving Ukraine all of this stuff. We should have given Ukraine this stuff yesterday. But do remember that the President of the United States does not have, in fact, a blank check from the Congress. We gave, when I was in Congress last year, we gave the President a certain amount of money that is finite in order to provide this weaponry. So had we given a squadron of F-16s several months ago, there would have been less money for mine clearing equipment, less money for ammunition, less money for other things. These are trade-offs that the people planning the assistance to Ukraine have to take into account. And given that right now, there is a very real risk that the House of Representatives in Washington is not going to provide more assistance in a timely way. If I were in the White House, I would be a little bit cautious about doing more things that are extremely expensive when the money is close to running out.
Okay, thank you. I see Alexei wants to jump in, and I want to have Doug as well. Okay, Alexei, quickly, and then give Doug.
Yeah, Jim, very quickly. But what said Tom? But we have Lend-Lease, and President can use this instrument too to send weaponry to Ukraine. And the second thing is, when we're speaking about the price, I should believe me, if Ukraine would have in February, March of last year, everything that we received after, much later, howitzers, HIMARSs, and all the Patriots, we would finish the war very quickly. We just didn't have what to purchase Russians when they were retreating, and that happened several times already. So by prolonging this help, but making it incremental, we are in reality making it more and more expensive, both from the position of Ukrainian lives and from US taxpayers' dollars. Thank you.
Alex, you need to understand that Lend-Lease is not an appropriation. And without the appropriation, Tom is absolutely right. Lend-Lease is an expression of principle as opposed to an actual authority to transfer resources to Ukraine. Doug, do you want to jump into this last before we turn to audience questions?
Sure. I think we've covered the resource thing. Just to emphasize Tom's point, as I understand it, the 40-some billion appropriated in actual resources at the end of last year, under the last Congress, will be expended in early fall this year. So this is, but well before we get to Washington, the Washington summit next summer, we have to cross this threshold in terms of continuing military support. I do want to offer that out of Vilnius, I think there's one too little appreciated step forward, and that's the creation of the NATO Ukraine Council. And you know, this quickly gets dismissed because, you know, there was a NATO Ukraine Commission and now it's a NATO Ukraine Council. It just sounds like NATO, you know, NATO jargon. But the Council allows Ukraine to convene as a member of the Council. Ukraine itself can now convene a meeting of Ukraine and the 31 NATO members. And it seems to me if Ukraine is creative, it can use the NATO Ukraine Council as a vehicle to answer many of the questions that we're contending with in this session. So what are the conditions for membership? That ought to be a top line, high priority agenda item of the NATO Ukraine Council. And it's appropriate that that be done behind the closed doors of the Council rather than in public, because a public statement making explicit the conditions publicly only gives Putin targets, right? So that he could oppose this, he could obstruct that, and so forth. So doing this behind closed doors by way of the NATO Ukraine Council, I think, is a very positive vehicle towards Washington. And let Ukraine spell out what it's doing on the democratic principles front. Let Ukraine spell out what it's doing on the military interoperability front. Let that discussion take place by way of the Council. And so we should make, I hope Ukraine will make good use of the Council. And, you know, if the North Atlantic Council at 31 meets every week, a couple times a week, I would hope that the NATO Ukraine Council meets just as frequently.
Okay, thank you. We have a provocative question from Matthew Vincent, which I think you may all want to crack at. It reads like this: Ukraine's membership in NATO has been very clearly articulated as a red line for Moscow. Considering the current trajectory of the war in Ukraine, questions of escalation, armaments, and nuclear proliferation in Belarus, as well as worsening fissures in President Putin's regime, how does one reconcile the possibility of Ukraine joining membership against this red line from Moscow? Quite a mouthful, but I think you get the intent. Okay, Alexei, I think we can give everyone a shot at this, but go ahead.
Oh, but don't believe in these red lines of Putin. All these is bluffing. The red line was a NATO movement to the east, I want to remind you. And now he has more than 1,000 kilometers border with Finland and you border with NATO. And in reality, the distance between Latvian border to Moscow and from Ukrainian border to Moscow, it's almost the same. So all this is bluffing. Putin just wants Ukraine to be part of Russia. That's all. And after this, he will continue. After this, he will go further. Then he will attack other countries which are not under NATO umbrella. And finally, if he would be successful, he will attack one of NATO countries, or, for example, all Baltic 3 countries at once. So don't believe in these so-called red lines. The only language he understands is the language of force.
Okay, thank you. Tom, you in describing the administration calculations, you spoke about making sure Ukraine does not lose and also not escalating. So how do you answer this question?
You know, I keep hearing people say that, you know, we can't let Putin be humiliated at the end of the day. And I understand where that sentiment is coming from. But I think that ship has sailed. I don't see as a practical matter how we can protect Ukraine and Putin's ego at the same time. Because if we achieve the goals that set aside Ukraine's goals, that the United States government has articulated here, if we achieve those goals, Putin will be humiliated. There's just no way around that. And ultimately, I think the best way to manage that, the best way to manage a dangerous Russia, is to do the thing we have done for 6 or 7 decades in Europe to prevent war, and that is to bind democratic countries together in the strongest possible defensive alliance, and to include within that alliance the democratic country that is now doing the fighting for all of us. That is scary for some people because it involves a commitment to fight if necessary to protect Ukraine. But what we've learned in history is that when we make a commitment to fight if necessary, it becomes less necessary to fight, whether that's NATO, whether it's our defensive alliances with South Korea and Japan. It's the best mechanism we've ever devised for keeping the peace in the world.
Thank you. Kathleen, do you want to jump in on this, or Doug?
I mean, I can only add to what Alex said, that, you know, one thing we've learned, not only during this year and a half of the war, but having been situated here in Warsaw where we are, is that the Kremlin is a lot of smoke and mirrors. And you need to differentiate what is, you know, really true and what is just rhetoric. And I think we were all very surprised how many red lines that have been crossed in Ukraine, and Russia did literally nothing because it simply cannot afford doing anything. In terms of NATO enlargement, I think, again, we heard similar rhetoric regarding, you know, enlarging to Sweden, to Finland. There were supposed to be consequences for these countries if they ever dare to join. As we've seen, that has not happened. But even our region has been threatened many times by Russia. But at the end of the day, what Russia does understand is that if we make that commitment and have somebody join NATO, it is an alliance that truly delivers on security for these countries. And that is a real red line that Russia on the other side cannot allow itself to cross. So in that sense, I think, you know, Tom is absolutely right. We can't protect both the ego of Vladimir Putin and protect and actually attain these goals we need to attain in order for Ukraine to win. The only thing I would stress, because sometimes, especially I think in Washington, this is not underlined enough, we often don't think what happens if Ukraine loses, not what happens if Putin, you know, loses his face or Russia loses, but what happens if actually we are not able to deliver the help that Ukraine needs, and Ukraine loses the war. I think we're so self-congratulatory at some point that we assume that everything is going so well that the only concern today is, you know, what happens if Putin loses Crimea. But that's completely untrue. If you look on the ground, what's happening, if you look at the morals, you know, also of people who are becoming more and more frustrated. Again, they don't want to stop fighting, but they feel they don't get enough of support. We need to remember that the cost of Ukraine losing will be so huge for NATO, not only for my region, Central Europe, but for NATO and for the transatlantic alliance, that we might not be able to bear it. And definitely then we will be the one having to fight, starting from Poland and the Baltic states.
Thank you. Doug, you want to jump in?
I echo all the comments already made. I mean, in essence, Putin has violated his own strategic objectives. I mean, or restated, Putin has violated his own red lines. I mean, Ukraine is more united than it's ever been. NATO is more united than it's ever been. It's provided more military support than ever imagined to Ukraine. NATO is enlarging. NATO has, I think, more than doubled its land border with Russia by way of the accession of Finland. So Putin should stop laying out red lines that he then repeatedly violates himself. Look, this is, I don't see how this continues with Vladimir Putin at the helm of the Kremlin, but that's an issue for Russia to decide. Our most immediate task is to help Ukraine survive.
Okay, thank you. We have a long comment/question from Laurel Atkinson, and it's too long for me to read through the whole thing, so I'll try and pull out the major point. Shouldn't the primary objective, she asked, be to form new agreements between NATO and Russia, not just for progressive security, but to end the war? And shouldn't future agreements between NATO and Russia be in respect of the actual geographical context of the North Atlantic for inclusive, comprehensive security? I think that's a reference to the fact that Ukraine is not so close to the Atlantic Ocean, and it is close to Russia. And then finally, wouldn't Ukrainian membership in NATO promote the predominance of power politics within international relations, whereby states interact via security blocs and defense sales and deepen the divide between autocracies and democracies to the detriment of global stability? Now there's an argument.
Very briefly, yeah,
please,
John, very briefly. Russia has not respected any international treaty in the last, years. It has been proven as a country that is simply unreliable. Getting into the negotiation table today with Russia and having it sign some kind of a security deal, a new security architecture, is simply it's not a reliable partner for the West, and it has proven that any agreement it signs, it is ready to break the moment it feels the power to do so and the capacity to do so. So unfortunately, for the foreseeable future under this regime and with this Russia, I think the only thing we have left is not a negotiating table, but deterrence when it comes to Russia.
Does anyone else want to jump in on this question, or should we move to the next one? Okay, we'll move to the next one. Let's see now. That's right. Here's a question from Mitchell Aldridge. And I think, Doug, this is for you, since you are our ambassador in NATO. He says, Article 5 does not oblige members to go to war, only to consult on next steps. Therefore, admitting Ukraine while this war continues does not drag the other 31 members of NATO into the war. And the alternative view encourages Russia to continue the war indefinitely. What do you think?
Well, the question is correct in the sense that Article 5 doesn't automatically commit ground troops, for example, in support of one ally or next. In fact, the exact language is something along the lines of each ally, an attack on an ally will cause each of the existing other allies to respond, to include potentially a military response, but it doesn't commit to a specific response. On the other hand, if an ally were attacked, if Ukraine were a member and Ukraine were attacked and the US and others did not respond with military support, then Article 5 is not the sort of security guarantee and does not have the deterrent effect that it's had now for 70 years. So while Article 5 is not specific, I do think in the case of an armed attack, an obvious armed attack, it would be necessary to respond beyond what we're doing right now. And as good Americans, we should remember that the only time Article 5's been invoked was on September 12th, 2001, the day after 9/11, when it wasn't America coming to the assistance of European allies. It was the reverse. It was European allies standing in unison and coming to support America in the face of the attack on 9/11. And the result was a 20-year commitment in Afghanistan, where allies fought alongside of us. So Article 5 is is constructively ambiguous in sense of exactly what the response would be. But the key is that there will have to be a response.
Thank you. Okay. We have a question from Ambassador Paul Van Doren. I'm trying to find, there it is. In light of the outcome of Vilnius, how can Ukraine become a member of NATO if the war turns into a frozen conflict? Bethany, you want to try that one? Oops, sorry.
I can
Okay,
jump
Alexa,
in.
go ahead.
Thank you. I feel that there were precedents when the countries were entering NATO in a kind of parts. I mean, like Western Germany became member of NATO, and then when Eastern Germany joined, it automatically became member of NATO too, these territories. So I don't like this scenario because I want Ukraine to clearly win the war and to restore international law that not only Ukraine, but the whole world will benefit from this, because we need to restore international law in the end of the day. And that means to restore internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. But I don't think that some kind of frozen conflict is an obstacle on the way to have Ukraine inside NATO.
Thank you. Tom, you kind of addressed this in your comments earlier. Do you have anything you want to add here?
Yeah, and I would first add to the historical examples. West Germany is, none of them are perfectly analogous, but they're all instructive. So West Germany, we brought them into NATO just a few years after the first Berlin crisis, which almost sparked World War III, and a few years before the next Berlin crisis that also almost sparked World War III. So it was a very dangerous situation. The status of East and West Germany was still quite unsettled. And West Germany made a decision, we're going to focus on integration into NATO and in the West before we resolve the ultimate fate of Germany, whether it will be unified or not. South Korea is another example. It was mentioned before, we have troops there, but we also have a NATO-type mutual defense treaty with South Korea, which we entered into minutes after the end of the Korean War, in which thousands of Americans had died. And that has been a very dangerous situation, an unresolved situation for decades. South Korea still claims North Korea. We still believe that the Korean Peninsula should be reunified, but it's a defensive treaty. And so our obligation does not extend to helping South Korea should it choose to, somehow reunify the peninsula by force. We are not obliged under that treaty to help. We are only obliged to help if South Korea is attacked. Even Japan has unresolved territorial disputes with Russia, for example, ever since the Second World War. We are obliged to defend Japan should Russia somehow use force, for example, or China. We are not obliged to help Japan go to war offensively to regain what it considers to be its lost territory. And so you can see that there is at least a potential model here, if Ukraine were to accept this idea, that maybe Crimea has not been retaken. We all recognize that Crimea remains part of Ukraine in the way that we did for the Baltic states being independent for many, many years. But we do bring Ukraine into NATO. Article 5, which is real, I agree with General Lute, we can't dilute the meaning of that. But Article 5, we say in advance, only applies to defending Ukrainian liberated territory against a further attack or invasion from Russia. It does not oblige the US military to fight on the beaches of Crimea to regain that territory if Ukraine chooses to do that. That is a possible scenario if we decide to choose it. And frankly, I think embracing a scenario like that would end the war sooner for everybody. It would actually be the definition of the end of the war, rather than, I think, a much less likely definition, which would require Russia to somehow sign a document acknowledging that it has lost. I don't think that will ever happen. So we're going to need something else.
Thank you. We are now at the witching hour. It's 9 o'clock. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a wonderful discussion, very thoughtful discussion. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. And we'll be continuing doing more on Russia's war in Ukraine, American policy, and for that matter, the developments of the Washington summit, NATO summit next year. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Guys, great conversation.